Thanks for joining us this evening for the penultimate event in our Border Literature series. My name is Breed and I work in the Learning and Programming section of the National Library of Ireland, the building that you see behind me there. Border Literatures is a reading and discussion series that shares diverse literary perspectives on borders and is framed within our Decade of Commemorations programme. Border Literatures is curated by the National Library of Ireland and Professor Nicholas Allen of the Willson Centre for the Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. Border Literatures began in September, which seems like a long time ago, with a discussion on borders generally, and since then has considered works by Eugene McCabe, Andrea Carter and Sue Devon. This evening's discussion will consider Seamus Heaney's Open Ground poems 1966 to 1996. And if I may, I'd just like to mention the National Library's exhibition Seamus Heaney Listen Now Again, which is continuing at the Bank of Ireland Centre in Westmoreland Street in Dublin. And there are virtual tours available monthly on it as well. And you'll find all the details on the library website at nli.ie. We would ask you to put any questions in the quick Q&A function, and my colleague Ruth will monitor those throughout the evening. Chairing our discussion this evening is Gail McConnell. Gail is a senior lecturer in English at Queen's University Belfast and publishes poetry and literary criticism. She is the author of The Sun is Open and Northern Irish Poetry and Theology, and also some pamphlets on poetry. Gail's writing interests include violence, creatureness, queerness, and the politics of literary form. And now I will hand over to Gail and enjoy the evening, everybody.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. Welcome, everybody. I think people are still coming into the virtual room. You're all very welcome. It's a great pleasure to be with you to talk about this book, Seamus Heaney's Open Ground. We are probably just going to scratch the surface this evening. There are so many things we could discuss, but I'm really, really pleased to be joined by two wonderful panelists, Dr. Maria Johnston and Dr. Stephen O'Neill. I'll just introduce them briefly, though I'm sure they and their work are known to you. So Dr. Maria Johnston is currently a visiting research fellow in the School of English, Trinity College, Dublin. She's an established poetry critic and has published widely on modern and contemporary poetry. Her reviews have appeared in a huge range of publications: Poetry Ireland Review, Poetry Review, the Irish Times, the Dublin Review of Books. Maria has contributed essays to the Oxford Handbook of Modern Irish Poetry, the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary British and Irish Poetry, the Cambridge Companion to Irish Poets, and a History of Irish Women's Poetry. She is the co-editor of Irish Women Poets Rediscovered, published last year by Cork University Press. And then we have Dr. Stephen O'Neill. And Stephen is an Irish Research Council Enterprise Research Fellow at the School of English, Trinity College, Dublin, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art. His research project examines the literary and cultural history of Ireland from 1920 to 1955, focusing on the impact of the state on culture and in particular representations of partition in Ireland. With Emma, he's working on critical and practical approaches to representing and commemorating the foundation of states in the early to mid 20th century. He has published articles on Irish literature and culture, and his monograph, Irish Culture and Partition, 1920 to 1955, is forthcoming with Liverpool University Press. Welcome, Maria. Welcome, Stephen. It's lovely to have some conversation with you this evening. We've been swapping emails in anticipation of this event, and I feel like we have probably enough we could talk about for 4 hours, and we only have 40 minutes before we're going to turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. So hold your questions and we'll invite them at about 1:45 in Q&A. So we're going to talk about a few different aspects of borders and boundaries and crossing those borders and boundaries in Heaney's body of work, an extraordinary body of work. I want to begin by thinking about the borders that Heaney perceives in his earliest experiences, really. Describing his home place, Seamus Heaney said, "I grew up between the predominantly Protestant and loyalist village of Castle Dawson and the generally Catholic and nationalist district of Balahi, on a border between townlands and languages. From the beginning, Seamus Heaney's world was defined by borders and division as he grew up in between." So Maria, Stephen, let's open this up. What are some of the ways that Heaney explores this consciousness of borderlines and the sense of in-betweenness in his poems?
Yeah, well, I mean, as that wonderful quotation illustrates, there's a, I think his mind and his imagination is shaped by borders and divisions from the very beginning. And there's, at the back of Neil Corcoran's wonderful critical study of Heaney, which I would recommend to everyone as required reading. I don't think it has been bettered, in fact. But there's an interview with Heaney where he talks about the fact that Mossbawn itself, of course, you know, the very etymology of Mossbawn is a metaphor for what he calls the split culture of Ulster. So moss coming from the Scots, from the planters, and bawn, an English word, but which then is also resonant of the Irish language, and bawn, which is of course Irish for white. So that even in that Mossbawn, and if we think of the famous, very well-known poem Mossbawn Sunlight, you know, that there's the tick of two clocks, even in that poem, you know, where we might not expect that kind of tension, it's there. So it's formative, really, in terms of his poetic imagination. And as I say, in that interview with Corcoran, he talks about feeling always displaced from the start, you know, that he's in that kind of in-between, the in-betweenness is his condition from the very beginning. So he's going to Anahorish School, which is in, I think, the Armagh district. There's a wonderful vignette, actually, that he offers in his essay, Something to Write Home About. And he's describing how he used to deliver milk in the evening. And even just that short journey to the next house actually necessitated him crossing, crossing a boundary, an invisible line between, again, Armagh and Derry. So there was no line in the road, there was nothing physical to suggest a border. But as he says, in his mind, it was a journey of a vast distance because he was so aware of that. Also, of course, then in the locality, there was the kind of sectarian lines, the lines of antagonism and affiliation, as he describes them elsewhere. So it's there from the very beginning, that sense perhaps of not having that certitude and being uncertain in himself, and those divisions. But of course, the divisions become enlivening as well. And in a poem like Terminus, he explores those. He explores that sense of being in between. So, I mean, I don't know whether Stephen wants to come in here, but we can certainly look at Terminus as well. Terminus being the Roman god of boundaries, and Terminus becomes a figure for Heaney, and he imagines himself as kind of occupying this position in the middle of a stream. At the end of Terminus, we have Hugh O'Neill and the Earl of Essex, who are parleying midstream. So the idea of stepping stones, of crossing, you know, of a borderline being something that is there to be crossed as well as contested, is very strong there. But it's a really interesting poem, because I actually was looking at the drafts of this poem in the National Library just last week, and he in one of its earlier drafts, it contains, and I might just read out the beginning as it appeared. When I hoped there I would find an acorn and a rusted bolt, and when I thought twice, the verb revised itself to poked. So even there, in that earlier draft of the poem, he's writing in the revision. He's not confident using that word hope because it's not a standard English word. And he thinks of revising it to poke, which would obviously be perhaps a more standard term. Now he doesn't obviously put that into the published version, but it's very interesting to see that, you know, to see the act of revision, to see the act of second thoughts at work in the poem. Is it any wonder when I thought I would have second thoughts? So he never felt that certitude of belonging in one place, as he puts it. And the poem ends in a kind of a freeze frame, as he has described it. It ends in stasis, which is really interesting, I think, because in a way it's as though he's passing it over to the reader, you know, that we're there midstream, and it's almost asking the reader or implying that the reader thinks about what should happen next, you know, at this moment of stasis. it's just wonderfully done. It's so subtle and it's so nuanced at the end. It's really a poem, I think, that repays rereading and really makes us think, which I think the finest poems should do.
Thanks. I just might come in there if that's sorry, Gail.
Yeah, please do.
Sorry, excuse me, Gail. So I think, very much Terminus makes us think really about what a border poem is, given, the classical allusion that Heaney makes, undertakes. And the question really, I suppose part of the brief what we have here is to think about what border writing is, or what a border poet is. And of course, like that, for someone like me, who's like just a jumped up cultural historian, like the idea of what a border is has to be something about partition or something about the political geography. But when you read the early Heaney particularly, what you see are different kinds of borderlands. It makes you actually question really, just if you just really read the poems, even within the early parts of Open Ground, what a border poet actually might be. Obviously there's going to be the borders of languages and using those kind of spatial metaphors. But when you compare, say, his locality and the description of it to like even something like Paul Muldoon or Spike Mulligan or any of the various writers of the Irish border, borderlands, particularly those who live close and saw its kind of maybe its ridiculousness and maybe all its kind of its economies as well. Heaney is actually quite far away from that. Heaney's actually quite self-contained. It's his townland is a thing in itself, and when he sketches it out in such detail, the Dennis O'Driscoll in Stepping Stones, you get a sense that like it's the local. It's nothing really necessarily to do with the national, or at least that's one reading of it. If the most observable divisions in Heaney's early poetry are between space, thinking about the idea of the rural and the urban, the kitchen and the land, and these, go through in things like the early purges and digging, also in Follower, of course, also between generations, and also, I think a clear division between genders. The national geography somewhat seems to be placed with like, a more specific mapping of this townland and a more like sort of local idea of what place is. Of course, now this sort of brings me to the question, which I would sort of ask as soon as I was asked to do this very kindly by Nicholas. What is like a border poet, or what is like a writer of the border? We know what Paul Muldoon is from poems like Unapproved Road, or poems like Anshaw, or even the Boundary Commission, very clearly playing with the idea of what a border is. But Heaney, of course, does touch upon the border in certain, but it's not like sort of central to aesthetic. Central to aesthetic is actually fixity, as opposed to the kind of, uncertainty really of national borders. But what I think is also important, and I think Gail has actually written about this herself, the idea of actually the border as shaping and conditioning, this idea of like two communities, or I hate that word, by the way, two communities in the north, like shaping and conditioning someone's identity because of the fact that you're enclosed within that particular place. And this sense of place is actually directly related to the idea of borders, not just between states, but also between counties and also between townlands, as Maria has sort of suggested. So I think that's why Terminus is actually quite an interesting way of rethinking not just what, like, say, Heaney's poetry is in relation to the border, but also maybe what, some of the very odd, maybe residency requirements, or even kind of odd sort of subject matter requirements are for writing about the borders, because any writing of an island, maybe which has a border on it, might be considered in some way as shaped and conditioned by that. And that's certainly something that I would argue both here and in the rest of my work.
It's really interesting, Stephen. As you were talking there, I was thinking about Cavan and the idea of the parish, actually, and the parochial, and that sense of the townland and the smallness, and against the idea of the metropolis or the national, writing that locality, but through that writing, the epic, the mythic, sort of almost, but from that local stuff. And Heaney, writing about how powerful that was in his imagination. Cavan is writing. I mean, let's think about the border. Let's think about partition. We're in this period of centenary. We're thinking about beginnings, endings, that period. I mean, let's think about the presence or absence of that border in Heaney's writing. I think immediately of bogland, and I think of a phrase like our unfenced country. Heaney is the master of the negative prefix our unfenced country is both to fence and unfenced, something. It's kind of pre and post partition. It's sort of it's talking about a border and erasing it at the same time. And Heaney has described obviously his awareness of these sectarian borders that we've talked about already, but those are as you've said, shaped by a long history of colonialism and by the partition of Ireland. In Stepping Stones, Heaney said, "It would be untrue to say that I was without Catholic self-awareness. You didn't grow up in Lower Brookbus, Ulster without developing a them and us mindset. Even though there was no sectarian talk or prejudice at home, there was still an indignation at the political status quo. We knew and were given to know that Ulster wasn't meant for us, that the British connection was meant to displace us. No need to go into the list of complaints all over again. The discrimination in housing and in professions such as medicine, the paramilitary nature of the RUC and B Special Constabulary. The main thing is that you shared what used to be called an anti-partitionist stance. There's so much in that, you know, there's so much we could unpack. I love that Heaney says no need to go into the list of complaints, and then he goes into some of the complaints. So that you can feel that kind of push-pull of talking about the legacy of partition. I mean, there are a couple of things, Stephen, maybe I'll ask you to comment on this first. There's a few things that sort of are swirling around in my mind from this. One is this question of kind of where and how Heaney takes sides, or where he does explore this us and them mindset, which partition helps to foster. And the other is about the national border itself. You know, is it present in the poems or absent, or something of both? So I don't know, go with that wherever you want to, really.
Well, I mean, obviously the reading, which I mean, the poem which people, including Edna Longley, I think more recently Conal Power, might look at is a poem such as The Other Side. And of course, everyone returns to this, and you yourself would have as well. The idea of Heaney like kind of trying to understand his neighbours as a child as well. I think it's very interesting that it's always still from that perspective of a child rather than an adult, and that it's always very much about like kind of this rural kind of a kinship, kind of even between you know, what would be seen as a cross-confessional friendship. That's kind of like the encounters that you get certainly in Open Ground. Of course, what he's, as you know, we know what he's doing is also is removing a poem like Docker, where he gives a kind of quite a caricature of what and actually an incorrect caricature of what a Docker might be. A Docker basically being, you know, essentially someone who's prone to domestic abuse, but also kind of completely anti-Catholic and violently anti-Catholic, I would say. So there's elements, I think, of in his early poetry, which he clearly, I mean, is maybe embarrassed about or just wants to take out for whatever reason in the 1990s in Open Ground, of this idea of non-understanding. And that's, but also you might even see that as being a kind of a non-understanding, a sort of Belfast or city mindset, you know, not understanding actually something which is a different border, which sort of is more obvious maybe in his poetry. But on the other side, you get this idea maybe of there's certainly a difference which is recognized, but even as Edna Longley talks about, you know, there is at least some idea of rehearsing the kind of Old Testament, whereas, you know, Heaney's family are sitting down to the Rosary, he's thinking about the idea of textually the Old Testament as being important to his neighbours. So that's one thing I thought which is quite important about maybe this recognition of the other side. And of course, once he goes to Queen's, as we all know, the story's well known about whether or not Michael Longley and Jarek Mackle were in the group, which we don't have time to talk about. He clearly finds a certain kinship there, which is intellectual. In terms just of the sort of anti-partitionist stuff and the kind of like rendering of the national boundary in Heaney's work. Now, maybe in a bit we'll talk about you know, the flight path or something like that, which it's on a train and there's a certain obligation in going into Belfast or something. But I think there's also a sense that like John Hume really is the one who's kind of shaping what he's thinking, particularly in their life. You know, he talks about, you know, no need to go on the list of complaints all over again. There's almost a tiredness there, even if he does undercut it by listing it out. And then he talks about the main thing is that you shared what used to be called an anti-partitionist stance. I think what used to be called is doing a lot of work there. And I think it's doing the same kind of work that John Hume was doing at the same time. You know, he writes in an introduction to Benedict Kiley's work, Counties of Contention, which is about the border, about the idea of partition was a vivid memory and a lasting shock in like sort of the context of sort of the 1950s or 1940s in Ireland. But at this stage, you know, it doesn't really matter because of, you know, what we've achieved with the Good Friday Agreement. I think Heaney, you know, might have been sort of central in maybe creating an imaginative space, you know, as he does sketch out in his Nobel lecture, in which, you know, certain terms might become altogether less binary, sorry, and altogether more binding. But also, I think what's really important about it as well is that, you know, it also comes this rejection of a certain type of politics, which is quite subtle when he talks about how it used to be called anti-partitionism. What he's clearly doing is claiming a different trajectory for something like constitutional nationalism, which he sort of has some sort of, I think, affiliation to, but doesn't necessarily always state it in that particular way.
Thanks, Stephen. Marie, let me ask you.
Maria.
I think you're with us.
Yeah. Have I frozen? No?
No, I can hear you now.
We can hear
No?
you.
Okay, sorry. I didn't quite catch.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit.
Or
just sort of raising this question of the presence, I suppose, of the national boundary or the national border, whether or not we see that in the poetry, and how Heaney identifies in certain ways as an Ulster Catholic with, you know, a nationalist community that's living through this period of kind of structural violence, and the ways in which that exerts a presence in the interviews, but also in the poems too, and where the poems begin to negotiate sort of that issue of the national boundary particularly.
Yeah, well, I suppose that one of the poems that we've been considering is The Other Side, which is a poem that he himself felt kind of uncomfortable with, and he remarks on more than one occasion of the fact that he thought it might be too consoling, too benign, too tender in the face of assassination and explosion, too hopeful. But he goes on to say then that the encounter at the March drain represents the possibility of going out on the stepping stone. So again, you know, that same image of the stepping midst, to remove yourself from the heart of your home ground. And I do think that the poetry opens up, opens up a space. It's something, in fact, that Nick Laird, in tribute to Heaney, wrote about the fact that his writing allowed something like a space to grow where second thoughts were not only possible but imperative. And you know, poetry and poetic language is not the same as ordinary language. And I do think that one of the things that a poem like The Other Side does is it opens up a space for empathy, and you can see that, in fact, in the way that the poem itself is composed and worked through. It has a very interesting compositional history, and you know, he structures it as a triptych, which is something actually that you know, for the purposes of this discussion this evening, I was really struck by just how many Heaney poems are actually in sections or stations, you know, very often demarcated by these, you know, Roman numerals. So The Other Side actually was originally two other poems, one entitled quite different. It still had the imagery of the 2 feet, you know, where 2 fields meet. Obviously, the territory of the Moyola River, the stream, and of course the fact that the Heaney farm was marched by the farm of a Presbyterian neighbour. And then the other poem was, it was titled, the third section was originally titled Community Relations. So, and it was a separate poem. Now, we don't have time, obviously, to go into all the different kind of transformations and reworkings that he brought the poem. It's, you know, even the fact that he's putting, I think, so much thought into it, and obviously phrases like community relations, and Stephen has already kind of you know, remarked on that even that phrase or that term community relations is in it. The other title that he would have considered was The Other Sort, and that was actually included in a collection called No Man's Land, which was dedicated to David Hammond and Michael Longley. So it becomes a very important poem, I think, in the oeuvre, and playing with the notion of separation and coming together. I think it's also just a wonderful love poem, you know, even just in terms of the borders between men and between people, and the understanding that's there, you know, in terms of the neighbor obviously waiting until the rosary has ended. But that last stanza, if you like, should I slip away, I wonder, or go up and touch his shoulder and talk about the weather or the price of grass seed. It's a strange kind of moment of, again, dislocation, where the speaker is suddenly outside in the darkness with his neighbor, and that's kind of tentative and tactile quality in the writing there. I wonder, should I go up and touch his shoulder? The tactile quality there. It's also a poem that's in conversation with John Hewitt's The Hill Farm. John Hewitt, of course, being a a very important influence on that generation of poets, as has been well documented. But his poem, The Hill Farm, has the neighbour into the rosary. And just to quote some lines from it, I pictured every friendly face clenched in devotion of a kind, alien to my breed and mind. So, but I think Heaney he's in conversation with Hewitt, but he's also not satisfied, and comments on this kind of lack of inclusivity in Hewitt's vision as well, in Heaney's essay, The Frontiers of Writing. So the other side goes much further, I think, in trying to open up a space for empathy, and it's very sensitive to complexity, to cultural complexity, and so forth. So I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, in terms of the border itself, it's striking. I think how little the word border appears throughout Open Ground. In fact, the section which mentions the border bit in whatever you say nothing. Sorry, yeah, is not included in Open Ground. And the only other, I mean, if you look beyond Open Ground, then in Electric Light, there's that wonderful sonnet to Hellas, which has him crossing the border from Argos into Arcadia. But I'm probably misquoting, but again, it's he's crossing a border somewhere very different and opening it out into the global. Yes, but Kavanagh is certainly very important in terms of having that ear for border speech, as he needs.
Yeah, and direct speech, which you have.
And as you say, yeah.
Sorry, I think we're on a slight delay. Sorry, Maria, I cut you off. Didn't mean to.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I might have lost you for a sec. No, I think I was saying, yeah, and direct speech as well, which I love so much in the other side, and I hear sort of someone like Robert Frost behind that as well, I suppose. And a poem like Mending Wall. I mean, there are so many boundaries and borders sort of that are summoned up, if not through the word. And Stephen, I'm interested in your use of the word fixity, because there is a sense in which Heaney's imagination is profoundly shaped by binaries of all kinds, whether that's kind of earth and sky, or masculine, feminine, or the fire and the flint, those kinds of active and passive modes of poetry. There's so many things like that which we could sort of begin to unpack. But at a more simple level, what are some of the other borderlines that we see at work in Heaney's poem? I mean, to stay with the other side, one of them that's always been of interest to me is the borderline between earth and heaven, or the natural and the supernatural. Heaney has this kind of Catholic imagination, however secularized we might think about it, which gives him this kind of sacramental sense of things, that there's a border between what we can see and what lies, beyond sight. And that seems to be something that the Catholic and Protestant, farmers in this context have in common, actually, is this kind of belief in the numinous or the beyond. So, I mean, that's one. There are many others, the kind of fact of his university education and the way that brings distance within his own family structure, and sort of brings a kind of class difference in the most intimate context. It's another borderline that he's constantly kind of traversing and coming up on. But what are some of the other maybe even more profound borderlines that we see at work in these poems? Stephen, I'll come to you first, and then Maria, I'll ask you to. I'm
thinking it probably is like a very mischievous way of answering the question, but I'm thinking mostly of something that actually my friend and someone we all know, probably Scott McKendry sent me earlier on, which is actually a piece by James Fenton about Heaney and essentially his, as I put it, recruitment by two Morrisons in the 1980s. That is to say, Danny and Blake, but one for very different causes. The idea, I think, of Heaney basically being a sort of a crosser of certain codes. He talks about this he talks about this with Lou O'Neill and Casualty, about the idea of breaking our tribe's complicity. How culpable was he that night when he broke our tribe's complicity? Now you're supposed to be an educated man. Possibly the answer to that one. I think really about James Fenton talks about the idea of him being betrayed about or being accused of betrayal about 14 times by people like Kieran Carson, by James Simmons, by both Morrisons and a few other people as well, and how like Heaney himself actually really, I think this idea of like say a public responsibility is another one which a border that he almost refuses to cross on particular points. What I was struck by really was the fact that he actually directly discusses the idea of like changing from an I, or sorry, basically refusing to write as he did to Danny Morrison for anyone but himself. And he talks directly about the idea of basically using the I instead of the we. And there's another like kind of phrase that I think we might start, I mean, Bogland, of course, you know, we have no prairies to strike a big sun in the evening, but then also like how the I becomes like really, really important towards kind of more political aspects of the poem, and particularly in a poem like Exposure. You know, I sometimes see a falling star. If I could come on meteorite, instead I walk through damp leaves. Husk has meant flukes of autumn. And the repetition of the I is also one, obviously, I mean, in a very A-level reading or GCSE reading about solitude, but it's also, I think, about him. I mean, he talks about actually him being distanced from Belfast by, obviously he moves to Wicklow, and talks about how, you know, all of his friends in Belfast essentially you know, erect what he sees as like a cordon sanitaire, which is that they have this party line about what should be done with poetry and what shouldn't. So that's kind of, I mean, it's not really answering your question, but something I'm just thinking about for the past couple of hours, because of the fact that he mentions, if Maria was going to talk about, you know, the idea of him not mentioning borders, certainly in his poetry, the idea of like a border being, you know, there, I mean, literally between North and South, but also for him in Wicklow, and being kind of almost talked about up north as something else. Of course, as Conal Power mentions as well, Sean Arriata, Thomas Kinsella and John Montague in a bar in Dublin ask him where he stands in the north, and then he sort of seems to say, you know, I've stood there for 30 years, unlike anyone else at this table. He wants to say that, but he can't. So there's a sense, I think, as well of, you know, of him betraying even by crossing the border and by going to different places.
Yeah, those shibboleths and codes are really fascinating. I love how he writes about them in the school, in particular, you know, land of password, wink and all, and that kind of. Yeah. Maria, I mean, you mentioned earlier just, you know, the end of The Other Side, the question, should I slip away? There is this kind of self-questioning element in Heaney, isn't there? And in Casualty, we have that again, question me again. So there's a sense in which, to pick up on Stephen's point about the I is exploring the kind of complexity, that kind of Yeatsian conflict or Yeatsian complexity. And the I becomes a way to explore those different dimensions within the self. I mean, that's to take it somewhere else again. But let me ask you to go anywhere you'd like to with this.
Well, you mentioned Casualty, I suppose. So why not turn to that one? It's a magnificent elegy, and of course, an elegy is a very public forum of poetic address. So he's very consciously taking on the public mode of address in this poem, and it's something that he comments on later, and that he was very, you know, self-consciously setting out to write an elegy. Again, I mean, as with The Other Side, it's very much a poem that's worked over, and perhaps, you know, we should remind ourselves of the work of poetry as well. Heaney is often referred to as a very lucky poet, you know, that the whole fact of how he became so famous and garnered so much acclaim from early on. But there's so much work that goes into these poems. There's so much revision and rethinking and rephrasing and reshaping. You know, they're not easy poems. They don't come into the world easily. Which I think is important, and the texture of the poems actually, you know, kind of the texture kind of honors that. The use of language, he has such an ear for ambiguity in language, and you know, the kind of the hidden depths of it, you know, in a single word or in a single phrase. Casualty itself is haunted by Yeats, but it's also haunted, I think, by Louis MacNeice and his elegy for Graham Shepherd, The Casualty. In terms of its context, it's an elegy for Louis O'Neill, who was blown to bits when he disobeyed a curfew after Bloody Sunday. So that idea of transgression is very much there. And again, it's kind of embedded or interwoven into the texture of the poem and into the language that Heaney is using in the poem. So he writes himself, he discusses in Stepping Stones how the dilemma behind the poem is really how he's stretched between the impulse to maintain political solidarity and the experience then of a spiritual condition of complete solitude. And Louis O'Neill obviously stands as a figure for, that Joycean idea of non serviam, I will not serve. He's a figure of resistance. He's a figure for the independent self who transgresses and who is true to himself and to his impulses. So it's really interesting, I think, is a poem that complicates the border between the elegist and the elegized, because of course the qualities that O'Neill possesses are those that Heaney, in his uncertainty and in his guilty, he's a poet who dramatizes guilt, I think, and betrayal and these kind of darker emotions, the darker side of the human condition. So the border between the elegist and the elegized, I think, are really interestingly explored throughout this elegy. The border as well between victim and murderer, that these are not clear cut here, because of course Louis O'Neill, he did transgress, he did go against, and the question of his culpability obviously is at the very heart of the poem, and it's an unanswerable question. So I think it's that poem in Heaney's oeuvre where he's striking a new note, and he's going deeper, I think, into I think exploring his own tribe as he describes it here, and the complications within those kind of identifications. It's not, these are not clear-cut binaries here. You can see it even in the rhyme, the use of full rhymes and half rhymes, the insistent, relentless meter. It's a pummeling poem, and if you hear Heaney read it, which you should, because it is a performance piece as well. It's so raw, and it has this pummeling effect. So again, the reader is being implicated. I think the reader is being questioned as much as the poet is questioning himself. So we are involved in the poem, I think, and to be able to achieve that, I think, is really staggering, because it's not didactic, and the poet himself is actually being questioned. The end of the poem as well, I think, I think I might just linger on that for a moment as well, where he actually turns to the dead man and asks him to question me again. Dawn sniffing revenant, plodder through midnight rain, question me again. That not quite full rhyme at the end, that signaling a lack of resolution. It seems to be an elegy that has no consolation, and that can offer no consolation at the end. And the fact that the dead man cannot answer back, obviously, it reminds me of the wonderful poem Elegy by W.S. Merwin, which is just one line. Who would I show it to? It has that built into it, that sense that the dead cannot answer back. One key word, I think, in Casualty is that word remorse, and all, again, even just to unpack all the implications of that word remorse. It's perhaps the poet judging O'Neill's transgressive act in breaking the curfew. So it's one of those poems really that you could discuss it all night, and of course we don't have that much time, but there are so many borders that it explores and that it complicates, and through using this form of the elegy, which is very public, but it's also a very private, I think, poem as well, because of the intimacy of that address at the end. It's very private, and that wonderful declaration of love, in fact, in the first stanza. I loved his whole manner, sure-footed but also sly. And again, if you hear Heaney himself reading it, he puts so much feeling into that expression of love. It's love is a word that he doesn't use very often, and this is something he commented on, that love wasn't a word they used in the home and Malahi growing up. You never said the word love, but he just throws himself into that with such passion. So many borders, I think, are crossed here, and it's such a haunted and haunting poem.
I love that reading of the poem and the way that the overlays and complications of the elegist and the elegies. It's fascinating, fascinating. And your talk of love and earlier of the ticking of 2 clocks takes me back to that first poem at the beginning of North, and here is love like a tinsmith scoop. I'm thinking one of the poems that we know everybody has been asked to read and may know is the poem Two Lorries, that extraordinary sestina where you have these 6 words: ashes, lorry, Coleman, mother, macrofelt, load, which are repeated over the course of this poem. It's a poem in kind of 2 timelines, 2 things happening at once. We move between the 1940s and his mother, this extraordinary portrait of his mother, and the 1993, and the chilling choreography behind the bombing of the bus station. And there's an extraordinary way in which, I mean, death appears, and the death walked out past her like a dust-faced Coleman, refolding body bags, plying his load, empty upon empty, in a flurry of motes and engine revs. But which lorry was it now? Young Agnew's, or that other heavier, deadlier one, set to explode in a time beyond her time in Macrofelt? There's this extraordinary sense of the simultaneity of things, of kind of pre-Troubles and post-Troubles history unfolding at the same time, and death coming in like a sort of something out of a kind of medieval mystery play or something. It's an astonishing poem, and it's full of tenderness and feeling, but it also manages to take up, in terms of kind of the taking sides, I mean, it's an anti-terrorist poem. It's a poem about the devastation that this is going to kind of wreak. I mean, I don't even really know where I want to go with this, except to say it's an extraordinary poem for the way that it explores the borderland of peace and not, and particularly kind of the simultaneities of time. It seems to me that that's one of the unique gifts of the poem. What the poem can do is sort of to be in 2 places at once, 2 times at once. Stephen, Maria, we have a few minutes left to talk about this or anything else you think we haven't kind of touched on yet. So let me just open it up before we invite some questions for the audience. Stephen, let me come to you first. 2 lorries, or 2 times, or the ticking of clocks, or anything else you think we haven't said about borders in Heaney that we need to end on?
Well, you described 2 lorries so well. I mean, it's just that obviously the rural and urban service Belfast again, but also that I think you're right about the idea. I mean, obviously you're right about the idea of what poetry can do, and it kind of can, you know, occupy 2 time spaces, and almost a bit like the end of Casualty leave you kind of a bit divided as well, but at the same time as unlike unfenced, recognizing something while at the same time as maybe transcending that as well. That's really, I mean, it also makes you think of Station Island, and the way in which, you know, Station Island as a poem and a collection kind of looks at sort of different time periods and has encounters with different people, but of course that's unlike the other side. It's his side, or supposedly his side, as he sort of thinks. And yeah, so I think that's pretty all I can say about that. Other than obviously it's one of the only collected sestinas, you know, so it's almost like he sort of, you know, I can do this. Yeah, everyone.
I mean, it's one of the best in the Langhorne family.
Yeah.
You know, you have Elizabeth Bishop. This is up there, I think.
Yeah, no, I think, no, I mean, like, well, I'm not as well versed as quite literally than both of you, but I do think it is an absolutely fantastic poem in terms of the actual form, and you know, it sort of shows as well how even the borders of a sestina, or the kind of constraints of a sestina, might be something a Harry Houdini-esque escape. But
yeah,
Maria.
And then Leon Flynn, it's generative too. Leon Flynn has a poem, a sestina, kind of after this one too.
26.
Maria,
yeah.
Maria, talk to us about 2 lorries.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a poem that I'm actually obsessed with. I have Heaney reading this poem on my iPhone, and I, you know, when I'm dropping the kids to school, I'll listen to it. And one of the really interesting things actually about the experience of listening to 2 lorries is the fact that the borders of the poem itself, you know, the sestina obviously is it's a fixed form. It's a very rigid form, and if you look at it on the page, as you said, Gail, I mean, there's the 6 tilutons or end words: ashes, lorry, Coleman, mother, Marfelt, and load. You can see the pattern at the end of each stanza, where, you know, the intricate pattern of these end words that have to repeat as the poem progresses. But when you listen to the poem, you're not as aware of the fact that it is a sestina, in fact, because the narrative drive, the momentum of the words over the lines just carries you along. And I think it intensifies the kind of cinematic quality of the poem as well. You know, it's like a split screen where you have 2 timelines, 2 lorries. And it's a poem full of doublings as well. You have the two lorries, but you also have two mothers. You have the mother in the 1940s, and then you also have the Revenant, the mother returned as a ghost in the, you know, the future timeline, if you like, when it's fast forwarded. It's also a very interesting poem in terms of the borders of Irish poetry itself, or Northern Irish poetry, because Heaney himself stalled in composing this poem, and he reached for Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina. So the rain that comes in is actually rain from Nova Scotia, the rain at the beginning of Bishop's Sestina. If you remember, September rain falls on the house, and there's the grandmother there, of course, and the marble stove, which is, of course, so marvelous in itself. So he's indebted, and in a way it's like Bishop has actually helped his own Sestina into the world, because without him reaching for Elizabeth Bishop, this would not have, you know, the Sestina would not have unfolded. And in fact, fold is a really important repeated word in the poem. We have the folding and unfolding of bags, but we also have that word plying, which actually etymologically comes from, you know, placare, which is again to fold. And it's so sophisticated, you know, and it's a testament, and I think it's a great example of Heaney's sophistication and how alive he always is to the roots of words, to the roots of language, and many languages, of course. As a translator, he's crossing borders of language all the time as well, which is something perhaps we haven't had time to talk about here. The original title for Two Lorries was The Modern Mistress, which again, I think, and you know, this was the title. It wasn't just immediately discarded. I was looking at typescripts in the National Library last week, and you can see that The Modern Mistress is the title for quite a substantial amount of time. Many redrafts and reworkings carry that title. But again, that hints at the idea of betrayal. And we were talking earlier about the I in a Heaney poem. There's no I in this poem at all. The I doesn't come into it. And I've wondered, well, where is Heaney in this poem? You know, where is the poet to be? And you could imagine him as the child, perhaps, watching his mother, you know, watching her potential transgression with the coalman who's sweet talking her and wants to bring her to a film in Marifelt. So there's that sense as well, I think, of the border between innocence and experience, you know, the child's entry into knowledge, you know, into the knowledge of human life and love and betrayal, and all of, again, these darker emotions that his poems explore, I think, so masterfully. Even the cold floored waiting room brings us back to Elizabeth Bishop's poem In the Waiting Room, which is, of course, about this shocking realization, this tidal wave of discovering her own identity. I am an Elizabeth, you know, when she's reading the National Geographic magazine. So it's so sophisticated in its, and as Stephen mentioned, you know, using a Sestina or letting a Sestina use you as a poet. It's about that kind of showmanship. It's about a virtuosity, and you know, the element of performance in the poem is obviously very strong. But the phrase for me that it all hangs on, and I think very often in a Heaney poem, there's a particular image or phrase that kind of opens up everything, you know, that kind of almost takes the bottom from under you as a reader. It's that line, the conceit of a coalman, which when Heaney performs the poem, he actually does his mother's voice there. It's his mother who's and he puts on her accent. It's this kind of ventriloquization of his dead mother, and films no less, the conceit of a coalman. But you know, again, there's his mother is using the word conceit in one meaning, but obviously for a poet, conceit has another meaning, which is to do with metaphor. And you know, the kind of alternative universe that a poem itself can create. So it's very much, it reminds me of what Heaney says about Robert Frost, the poem being an event in language. You know, it creates its own event. The kind of inexorable formal recurrence means that it's almost a poem that doesn't end. It keeps, you know, going in a kind of a cyclical, perhaps, you know, that sense of entrapment of history itself, being entrapped. Just one last thing, in terms of the bombing of Marifelt in 1993, I was looking up online, just watching some news reports from the time, and it's really interesting that one of the victims, whose house was destroyed in the bombing, was a Mary Heaney, and she's interviewed on television. So I mean, whether or not Heaney watched that news report is beside the point. I mention it because I think it reminds us of the fact that, you know, during the Troubles, violence was brought home, and I think it's a poem in which you know, the violence is the violence of the bombing of Marifelt is brought home. It means that Heaney's childhood is shadowed, that he, you know, that it casts this shadow backwards in time over this and all those implications, you know, of darker forces at work. So it changes the past as well, and that's all built into the poem. I think it's such a masterful poem.
It is
in that way.
For me, the image that holds all of it, I think, is the 1940s mother, all business round her stove, half wiping ashes with a backhand from her cheek.
Yeah,
the ashes are the way that death comes home, and you have that resonance of Ash Wednesday, and it's extraordinary. There's so much we could say. We could have an hour on Two Lorries. We are moving to the Q&A part of our evening. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom. I see we have a couple in already, so I'm going to read these out because time is getting away from us. We're having so much fun. Anne Alcorn absolutely loves Two Lorries and is asking if we had any thoughts on whether borders are like mirrors into ourselves, and also finding ourselves on the other side of those borders. I think that has maybe cut out slightly early, but borders like mirrors. Okay, I'm going to hold on to that one and let you think about that for a minute. There's another question in from Carlin Billington, who says, could you consider Heaney himself as a poet who ultimately himself became borderless, at least in how he is seen internationally as an Irish poet rather than a Northern Irish poet? Does that matter? Is it a loss or a gain in a way? So there are two questions. One about borders like mirrors into ourselves and finding ourselves on the other side, and the other about Heaney as a poet who becomes borderless.
So I actually have one about the mirror and about the sort of the economy between Irish and Northern Irish. I mean, might be something that I think is a little bit, I mean, I don't know if that's really true, but, you know, it's like, I think he can be both those things. Like, he's very much, you know, that's what he talks about, and he very much who he is, you know, comfortable in some ways. He talks about this, of course, to Mark Crothers, when he talks about the idea of like whether being an Ulster poet was something he actually identified with. I think, you know, as he went on, he felt more comfortable with it because of the fact that, you know, things had gotten better. But there is like one very important, I think important for me anyway, part of Station Island, which Heaney actually does look into a mirror, or imagines himself looking into a mirror. He talks about himself, you know, at a party, been a drunk at a party, lulled and repelled by his own reflection. And when he sort of thinks about him looking into the mirror and seeing like a vision of his community, he sort of talks about, you know, I hate how quick I was to know my place. I hate where I was born. I hate everything that made me biddable and unforthcoming. And there's a whole section in which, you know, this is a poem really dealing about, you know, violence, particularly of the same kind of Two Lorries, but also of like kind of tradition, an Irish tradition, choices at the end of the poem, but also about maybe where Northern nationalists, or where Heaney himself might sit in there. And in looking into the mirror, I think he, and sometimes kind of, in some respects, kind of like rejects that kind of introspection, but he also goes back to this image of a tribe at the end of it, when he says, you know, and then I thought of the tribes whose dances never fail because they keep dancing till they sight the deer. And this idea of like, I don't know, I mean, Paul Muldoon recognizes a sort of certain type of fatalism of Irish nationalism and Irish Catholicism in this phrase, in this section, when he reviews Station Island in the TLS. But also what Heaney's doing is essentially diagnosing something which almost like is in looking at himself in the mirror, like, you know, like in a very metaphorical and a very poorly constructed metaphor in my case, he actually is almost diagnosing a particular fatalism in sort of like Ulster Catholics or Northern Irish Catholics or Irish Catholics, whatever you want to call them.
I'm going to try and paste into the chat that sort of some of that section he's been quoting. Stephen, it's fascinating, isn't it, in the shaping mirror. I always think of Robert Lowe and that, Maria, you know about that, but the influence of Lowe and something like that. That sort of, again, it's more of that self-thing, lulled and repelled by his own reflection. Maria, have you thoughts on mirrors?
I mean, I suppose
sorry.
Well, I mean, in terms of the reflection, it would make you think of a poem like Personal Helicon, wouldn't it? Which is that very early poem where he's looking into the well, and it's his reflection that it comes back up to him. Big-eyed Narcissus, into some spring is beneath all adults' dignity. I rhyme just to set the darkness echoing. Yeah, I mean, there's it's a poem dedicated to Michael Longley as well, so it's very much a poem of friendship. yeah, it is very interesting in terms of as well, I think. I suppose as in terms of poetry and how the writing of a poem, again, perhaps the border between the poet himself, in Heaney's case, or herself, and the eye of a poem, and it's interesting in the Sweeney poems where he uses this alter ego, which perhaps is a way of mirroring as well, or of kind of accessing other sides, and again dramatizing, and the dramatic voice in Heaney. So he's a poet who's very open to kind of that idea of the alter ego, or the oppositional, kind of the oppositions within himself, that can be reflected back through the process of writing poems and inhabiting other mindsets, inhabiting other personae. And I think perhaps that's something that's not discussed enough, the kind of dramatic quality, and even a poem like the Stranded Loch Beg is very much a dramatic poem that's dramatizing a state of mind, and again, articulating and exploring oppositions and tensions.
Absolutely, that's a really important point. Actually, I was just teaching Yeats the other week and reading a general introduction to my work. We're talking about lyric and dramatic mode and the poem as a way of exploring conflict, and that's certainly something that Heaney learns from Yeats. And you're right, he's not credited enough with that level of complexity. I think we've got time for one last question before I tell you about our next event in the series. Caroline says, does Heaney change as he ages through his poetry? Does he mature through his poetry, or is he formed early? Stephen, what do you think about that?
I think he definitely changes. I mean, he definitely changes. I mean, there's oscillates, though, doesn't like just change, and then, but he changes, even in his attitudes towards things. But I mean, you look at something like Distant Circle, another poem famously actually, where he's looking at his father's reflection in the mirror, and he kind of like takes a look back on various things and starts like changing his ideas and like things, and like even like, I mean, sorry, he did write an open letter then sort of toast the Queen, so there's a few things that change in the course that haven't happened there. But Open Ground is also, in terms of the selection, very interesting as a register of what he might want to read and what he might not want to read. And just a poem like Requiem for the Croppies being included in there, for example, he didn't perform it for like nearly 30 years, is an example of how things change. Just to finally say that Rosie Lavin has a book about how Seamus Heaney might change in relation to society and his audience, which is directly related to this and is far more eloquent than I could ever be in 30 seconds. So
30 seconds for you, Maria, on that, or anything you want us to end with, really.
Yes, well, yes, he certainly does change. One of the main changes is, I think, crossing that border, isn't it, between the kind of the earthly and moving into the kind of the more the airy. Paul Muldoon, of course, has that very humorous quip about Heaney. The physician of the earth has taken to walking on air, surf and turf, as Goethe said. I'm paraphrasing, but yes, it's that he starts to credit marvels, of course, as he puts it, waiting till nearly 50 to credit marvels, opening up that other side, and allowing him to cross, I think cross that boundary into the marvelous. One of my favorite poems is actually the final poem in his final book, which is A Kite for Evine, or Avine, as I think it's pronounced. And again, it's very much having to do with that, the kite, obviously airborne, and crossing boundaries between life and death, because of course it remembers his father as a maker of kites, and kite flying with his father, and with his sons, the long-tailed pull of grief. He's weighing griefs and losses in that poem. So very much, I think it's a poem that traverses the boundaries between earth and air, between the physical and the metaphysical, between life and death. And it's a translation, of course. It's a translation of a poem by Pascoli. So it's also crossing borders between languages in that way, Heaney as a translator. And it's a poem, I suppose, that articulates that need for both earthiness and airiness in Heaney. And even the most grounded image will often have will actually send us soaring in that way. The achieve of the mastery of the thing in Hopkins Windhover is there also. I think, you know, at the back of that poem.
Well, I hate to interrupt, but we are now at the borderline of 8 p.m. I'm afraid. Maria, Stephen, I knew we could do this for 4 hours, and indeed we could. We've had at least 80 people joining us this evening, and I know many others will catch up. Let me remind you before I thank you both and close this event that the final Border Literature Series event is going to take place on Wednesday, the 23rd of March at 7 p.m. That will be the concluding event of the series called New Horizons, a Conversation. It'll be moderated by Martin Doyle, and panelists will include James Patterson, Jill Crawford, Needy Zach, and Luke Cassidy. So please do join us for that event. Stephen and Maria, thank you so much. Let's do this again in person.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us and for listening, for your questions. And I think we are now at the borderline of this event, so we're going to wave you goodbye and wish you well. Thanks everybody.
So thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Thanks both.